So this is week 5. So largely we've talked at this point just about overall theology of missions. What is it? What are we doing? Why do we do it? We've talked about circles of influence and responsibility, how to share the gospel with people that are near you. We've done some training, 3 circles. Again, there are other ways you can do that. There are other methods you can use. And then last week we shared some testimonies and talked a little bit about fear and did a Cliff Notes version of apologetics. We've mentioned worldwide missions, right? We've mentioned cross-cultural stuff. We're going to get to that today and talk a little bit more about taking the gospel to the ends of the earth. I hope you've sort of realized when we hear the word missions, almost always we think missionaries that go to other places in the world. Well, we're 5 weeks into a missions class, and now we're sort of beginning to talk about what it looks like to take the gospel to other places. That sometimes I think by doing that, but when we hear missions and only thinking about foreign countries, what we're doing is kind of absolving ourselves of missions. Is that, well, I'm not called to go to Bangladesh, so therefore I don't have to be a missionary. I don't have to share my faith. Well, no, that's not true. We're all called to share our faith. So what we're going to do today is really think through this call to missions. Piper in his book, anybody ever read the book, Let the Nations Be Glad? It's a great book on missions. Piper in that book says that missions exist because worship doesn't. We believe that Christ is worthy of the worship of the whole world. And so we want people to know and love and follow Jesus. We want people to worship him. And so we seek to take the gospel to all the ends of the earth. Remember, we read in Matthew 28, the Great Commission, Jesus said, all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples, what? Of all nations, right? We take the gospel to the ends of the earth. We're called to reach all the nations. So we're going to talk a bit today about the missions imperative. Jesus has called us to go to the nations. Right, the Jerusalem, he says in Acts 1:8 that he tells the disciples to take the gospel to Jerusalem, to Judea, to Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. And that's what's happened. That the early church took the gospel first to Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. That we are a result of that we live 2,000 miles away in Frankfort, Kentucky, because the church was faithful to continue to take the gospel out. So this is what we're going to talk about a bit today. When you think about the missions imperative, I believe this is a blank in your book. If you have a book, were there any left back there? I'll print out some more for next week. If you have the book from the previous weeks, it's all still in there. But the mission imperative is that God will bring the gospel to all nations, right? The gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Matthew 24:14. Right? The gospel is going to go to all the nations. Revelation 5:9, we're told that before the throne of God are people from every tribe, language, people, and nation. Right? That the gospel is going to go forth. The word, I think Dr. York referenced this in his sermon last week. When we read the word nations, or Gentiles in the New Testament. Anybody remember what that word was? He said this in his sermon last week. It's the word ethne. Does that word look familiar to you? What's it looks like? Ethnic. Right, so when you read Gentiles, when you read nations in the New Testament, the word is ethne. We're going to talk today about the ethnes, about the nations. It's important to understand this concept of how we think about nations. And it's a little bit different biblically than how we sort of categorize nations. Right? So we think that the gospel is going to go to all the ethne, to all the nations, all the peoples of the earth. Right? This word, again, it's where we get our word ethnic from. So when we think about people groups, we're going to talk in a few minutes about different people groups. We're talking and trying to categorize ethne. Why, when we think about missions, why would we not want to primarily only think about geopolitical nations? So let's take, for example, Panama, right? So Kenny and Cheryl are IMB missionaries. They live in Panama. And we say the gospel is going to go out to all the ethnes, right? That these are peoples, to all the peoples. What problems might we run into if we consider peoples only to be geopolitical nation states? Putting God in a box, but even when we think about those nations, would it become easier or harder to determine who we've actually reached? They change all the time. Geopolitical nation states are always changing, right? And are geopolitical nation states only ever made up of one ethne? No. So Panama is a great example. Kenny and Cheryl are IMB missionaries to Panama. They work primarily with the Imbara people, they work with some other tribes as well. But the Imbara people are people that have for centuries lived in the hills of what is now Panama and Colombia. It's this place called the Darien Gap. This is it's very topographical. Right? So it comes here, you have Panama, and you have Colombia here, and then you have this big place called the Darien Gap, where there are no roads. The roads stop here, and then they pick back up in Colombia, and it's like a massive, I think it's a 200-mile stretch. It's jungle, it's right, and the border between the two countries is somewhere in that gap. It's up in the jungle. So they work with the Imbara people, who have for hundreds of years lived in this region, lived in these jungles. And they move freely between Colombia and between Panama, right? So some of them live in Panama, they have family in Colombia, they go back and forth, they cross that border all the time because there are no fences, there's no border station in the middle of the jungle. It is the wild, wild west. And so you have these people groups that they don't think of themselves primarily as Panamanian or as Colombian, they think of themselves as Imbara. They have a unique language. Right? When they go into Panama City, they have to learn a different language, right? It's a different dialect. It's a different language. They have their own culture, they have their own religion, they have their own communities, that they are in and of themselves a people group. So we talk about ethnes, what we're talking about is people group. People that generally share a similar language, culture, worldview, often geographic region. And those people groups often don't inhabit one country. And often countries have multitudes of these people groups, right? So that if you were to say, okay, well, we've reached Panama because we have reached the people in Panama City, right? The gospel went to Panama. If we're thinking about geopolitical nation states, we could say, okay, we sent missionaries to Panama City and we reached Panama. What does that do for the Imbara who are out in the jungle? Does nothing for them. Right? That for somebody from Panama City to come minister to the Imbara in Hake is almost just as cross-cultural as Kenny and Cheryl coming from Kentucky to minister to them. Right? That they share almost nothing with them other than the fact that they happen to live in the same geopolitical nation state. Right? It's an entirely different culture. Right? So when we think about ethne, the biblical word, when we think about the peoples, the Gentiles of the nations of the New Testament, we're thinking primarily people groups, people that share a common language, common culture, common worldview, and often a common geography. Not just simply have we reached that geopolitical nation, but have we reached those peoples, right? So you go to places like Brazil, there are lots of people groups there that have different languages, right? So that going and reaching one of those people groups doesn't often have anything to do with whether or not you're going to reach the other ones, because it's a different language, it's a different culture, they're in a different region. So we want to reach all the peoples of the world, which, according to this fantastic map, often crosses geopolitical national boundary lines. And those things don't fit cleanly within countries. So when we talk today about people groups, we think less. When we think global missions, we think less about boundary markers, right? We're not worried so much about which country the people are in, but we're thinking more about where are those people, what people groups are there that we have not reached. I'm going to throw this up, and I'm going to give you some updated numbers, because I could not find this chart with updated numbers, but I could find the updated numbers. I just want to give you a snapshot of sort of what global missions looks like, and all that we are up against. So you'll see here a categorization of different people groups, and then they have a status level 0 to 6 next to them. So this chart says there are 11,730 different unique people groups in the world. The latest statistic is up just a little bit, 11,948. Why would that number go up? Yeah, as we have access to new areas, sometimes we find new people groups that we didn't know were there before. Sometimes, as we begin to work with people groups, what we thought was one group actually is not one group. It's actually three groups, and they don't like each other, right? We had been classifying them as one group, and then when we actually have access and we get there, we realize, oh, this isn't one group, this is three groups. These are, right? So that number, again, these are our best job, right? The Lord knows, right? But as best we can tell, right now the IMB classifies and says there are about 11,948 people groups in the world. So this is why we think about people groups and not just nation states. Right? If we just think about geopolitical nations, well, we've taken the gospel to nearly every nation in the world. We have not taken the gospel to every people group, right? To everybody in their own language in a way that they can understand. So that number's gone up a little bit. And then we classify these people groups according to their status level. So the 0 status level means, well, we'll start at 6, right? 6, you're qualified as a 6 if you are greater than or equal to 10% evangelical. Right? So as best we can tell, 10% of the population of those people groups is Christian, that they've trusted Christ. Right? So that's about 1,800 people groups, which makes up about 7.5% of the world's population, about 569 million people. Going down from that, a level 5 means you are greater than or equal to 5% Christian, 5% evangelical, right? So that's about another 1,400 or so, about 1.8 billion people, or about 24% of the world's population. You go down to 4, right? 4%, or level 4 means that less than or equal to, or greater than or equal to 2% are evangelical. Does that sound like a big number? It's not a very big number. Right? Again, even with level 6s, we're only saying 10%, and all the way to at 4, we're at 2%. Right? So greater than or equal to 2% are Christians. 728 million people, so nearly 10% of the world lives as a part of a people group where 2% are evangelical. All right, now is when we begin to go down. Level 3, about 376 people groups, give or take. Level 3 says that there are less than 2% evangelical. But there is, within the last 2 years, at least a widespread church planting movement. Right? So they have very little Christians, but there is some active church planting work. That there is a movement within the last 2 years of people planting churches there. Right? That is 1.5 billion people. 1.5 billion people live on the planet in a people group where less than 2% of their people are believers, but at least there is some church planting effort. If you move to status level 2, I know you probably can't read these. Status level 2 is less than 2% evangelical, and there is some initial localized church planting effort within the last 2 years. It's not spread, it's not a movement, it's not gone to other places, but at least in some place in that area, there's been some attempt to plant a church within the last 2 years. That's nearly 1,800 people groups, or 1.9 billion people live in a place where there is less than 2% Christian, but at least somebody has tried to plant a church there in the last 2 years. Now you move to the bottom two statuses, status level 1 and status level 0. Level 1 is less than 2% evangelical. Some resources are available, but there has been no active church planting in the last 2 years. Meaning, we probably have the New Testament in your language. Maybe. And maybe for some of these, we have a full Bible. The full Bible has been translated, both Old Testament and New Testament. And there might be some tracts. There might be some resources in your language, but there is less than 2% evangelical, and there is no discernible church planting effort. If you live in one of those places, what's your chances of ever hearing the gospel? It's tiny. It's 4,500 people groups. 963 million people, or 12% of the world's population. And then that's it. Let's see if I can get this to come back up. The last one is the status level 0. Again, I'll give you some updated numbers in a minute if they come up. Status level 0 is there are no evangelical Christians that we know of. There are or churches, and there is no access to major evangelical print, audio, visual, or human resources. Right? So there are places where we've not yet translated. We still have translators. Wycliffe is a great organization that's still working to translate the Bible, right? You think about these 11,000 different people groups. That's a lot of languages. And somebody's got to learn those languages to try to translate the Bible into all of those languages. So if you live in a zero status level area, that means there are no Christians, there are no churches, and you have no access. There are no resources. There's no translation of the Bible in your language. There's no tracts. There's no books. There's nothing you can read. You have access to nothing. That's about 366 people groups, about 10 million people. I'm going to give you IMB's numbers. They're similar. So IMB says there are 11,948 people groups. Anybody know how many people there are on the planet? A guesstimate right now? You said 8 billion. 8 billion obviously is a guesstimate, but it's about. So 8 billion people, about 11,948 people groups make up those 11 billion people, right? The IMB uses language to call people unreached peoples, right? So for the IMB, unreached peoples are which there are less than 2% evangelical Christian, right? So it's similar to this chart, but this is the IMB classification. So unreached people groups are people groups, any of these 11,948, in which less than 2% of that population is evangelical. But of that less than 2%, there is at least some effort to spread the gospel. There is some church, right? There are some Christians, and there is some effort at some level to share the gospel and to plant other churches. That's about 7,252 people groups. Of this 11,948, over 7,000 of them have less than 2% evangelical, but at least have some Christians and have some church planting effort. That makes up, anybody want to guess what that number is? How much of this? What'd you say? 4.8. Think about that for a moment. There are about 8 billion people on the planet. 4.8 of them live in a place where there are less than 2% Christian. These are just the unreached people groups. They live in a place where it is highly likely they will be born, they will live their entire lives, and they will die and never meet a Christian. Never even run into one, much less hear the gospel. They'll never meet a Christian. They'll never run into one, right? It's a massive amount of people. Next, they classify unreached and unengaged peoples. Unreached and unengaged peoples are essentially their classification of level 0 and 1, meaning if there are Christians there, we don't know where they are. And there is no discernible church planting effort. That there is going to have to be outside help for the gospel to reach there. So at least with unreached peoples, there is some hope that of the 2% that are evangelical, there at least is some indigenous witness, meaning there is some people from that people group that could theoretically share the gospel and plant churches. When we move to unreached, unengaged people groups, it means we have no indigenous foothold. We don't have a 2%. We have that if churches are going to be planted, if there are Christians there, we don't know about them, or there are so few of them that it's going to require outside help for them to even plant churches, right? That they are not self-sustaining. They could not replicate on their own. They could not multiply. They're going to need outside help. So these are the unreached, unengaged peoples. A little over 3,000 of these people. And that makes up about 287 million people. 287 million people, unreached, unengaged, about 3,000 unreached, unengaged people groups. Right? So if we've said this about these 4.8 billion, that it's highly likely that they will be born, live, and die and never meet a Christian, how much more so then of those who live in unreached, unengaged people groups? right? At least there is a Christian that they might run into in these groups. And then if you're a part of an unreached, unengaged people group, there is no Christian for you to run into. There's nobody there. There's no church that is going to require somebody coming in. Now, what makes these hard to reach? At least with unreached peoples, we have some foothold. We can come and strengthen whatever is there, how small it is. We can come, we can use those believers to help translate the Bible. We can use those believers to help reach other Christians, right? And these unreached, unengaged people groups, what has to happen? Somebody has to come to faith, right? You're starting from scratch, and you're trying to reach those people so that they can reach their brothers, right? They can reach their sisters. They can spread. That's incredibly difficult work. This is Kenny and Cheryl in Panama. One of the reasons they've been really effective is because as they've reached Imbara, they have trained them to go and to reach more. That they can go to places Kenny and Cheryl can't go. Kenny can go to Colombia, but he can only go a few times a year, and he has basically a clock on him. He can only stay in Colombia for so long. He told me last time he was there, or I say last time, this could have been 2 years ago, who knows, that he was with his partners, and they were in Colombia, and there was a car that followed them the whole way. And he said, well, who are those people? And he says, oh, they're watching you. We've got about a couple more hours, and then we need to get you back across the border. Like, you're a white guy in Colombia. You're a target, so we right. But the Emperor can go wherever they please, right? They can get into Colombia. They can get to places that Kenny and Cheryl aren't going to get to. Also, they share the language. They share the culture. They grew up in those places. They know those areas. They have a greater sense of authority with their own people than Kenny and Cheryl do, right? So I want you to just think about these numbers for a second. 287 million people. That is 65 times the population of Kentucky. Live in a place where there is no Christian, as far as we can tell. 65 times the population of Kentucky live in a place where there is absolutely no gospel witness, right? That if they're going to be reached, it is still to come. That number is really kind of hard to fathom, to think about, that many people live in a place. How many churches, you know, to say this out loud, how many churches did you pass on your way to this church today? How many Bibles do you have sitting in your house? You have a Bible on your phone. You can listen to it. You can read it. You can read it in every translation you want to read it in, right? We have all of this access, and it's easy to think, well, everybody has this access. And it's just not true. Over half the world lives in a place where access to the gospel is severely limited, right? Or non-existent. This is why we care about missions, because a lot of the world is living in places where they are yet to be reached. Yet God uses the church to advance the gospel. God takes us, right? Isaiah 52:7, how beautiful upon the mountain are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, right? That Paul was part of in the early church, the first disciples and the apostles were part of the early church that sought to take the gospel, not just where Christ had been named, but what does Paul say? We want to take the name of Christ where he has not been named yet, that they were part of this missionary journey to take the gospel to places where Christ was not yet known. Paul preached to the people of Antioch, to the Jews that are there, right? That he says in Acts 13, he boldly declared, we are turning to the Gentiles, quoting Isaiah, I have made you a light to the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth. Right? That Paul and the early church and the apostles go to hard places. And we're going to talk about in a minute. I don't tell you these numbers to make you simply just feel guilty and to think, okay, well, when we go home today, we just got to sell all of our stuff and move to India, right? That is not what God calls everybody to do. God has not called everybody to go overseas. I think I said this week one of the things, if you talk to Kenny and Cheryl, if you talk to our partners in Birmingham, if you talk to missionaries on the field anywhere, they'll tell you one of the things they wish that American churches would do was be more careful about who they send them. Quit sending us your troublemakers. Quit sending us the people you don't know what to do with them, so you send them over. You think that, right, they're cantankerous and not helpful in the local body. You think they're going to do that in another country? No. Keep them in your place. Help them mature. Don't send them to us. Right? Not everybody should go overseas. Right? There are all sorts of reasons that you may not be best suited, that may not be what God is calling you to do. The point is not to make you feel guilty and to say, okay, you got to sell all your stuff tomorrow and to go overseas. But twofold is to say, one, God might call you to do that. I'm not the one who tells you to stay. Right? That's up to the Lord. If the Lord calls you, then you need to go. But partly to realize that what we do here is not just about what we have. It's so easy to remember, to forget. We have all this access. Right? We've got the Bible, we've got a church, we've got all these things available to us, and yet there are people all over the world who don't have that. And so maybe I'm not called to go, but there are things that I can do to help get the gospel to those hard places. This matters. We talked about this the very first week. We talked about the man on the island. Is there salvation in any other name outside the name of Jesus? No. Without the gospel, there is no hope. There is no hope. When we shared testimonies last week, we were thankful. We thanked God that somebody was faithful enough to come and to share the gospel with us. Whether that was your parents, or your teacher, or your pastor, or your piano teacher, or right, we thanked God for all of these people in our life, diverse people that God used, that they were faithful enough to come and to tell us the good news. Because if we did not hear the gospel, we could not be saved. Think about what happens to these people who are born and live and die and never hear the gospel. They don't have a chance to reject it because they never hear it. That they die without hope. They die without Christ. That it matters. This is why it matters. This is why we do things like Lottie Moon, Christmas offering. We'll talk more about these things. Let's keep rolling. The church then exists to make Jesus known, where we are and where Jesus has yet to be proclaimed. What I don't want to do is create this. I remember once I had a mission trip scheduled when I was in college that it ended up getting canceled. We were supposed to go to northern Iraq and lead a basketball camp. And, you can imagine why that got canceled in the early 2000s. It got canceled, but I remember raising money in my home church to go lead this basketball camp. And the biggest response I got from people in my home church was, well, there are people down the street that don't know Jesus. Why you got to go to Iraq? Why you got to go overseas? Why do you got to go somewhere else? Why can't you do a basketball camp down the street? Why do you got to go overseas? Right? Is that a fair criticism of missions? What do we say to that? Right? One, there's more access here. Right? So the kids down the street have a better chance of hearing the gospel here than a kid living in northern Iraq. What else?
I mean, it's just a desire that's in your heart to go where you're supposed to go. I mean, yeah, you can minister down the street, and you should while you're here, but the Lord's led you to go there for a short period of time. That's when you minister the gospel.
Yeah, you're trying to follow the calling of God. We don't have to choose between the two. Right? That it's not an either or. All right, either we're going to go to the nations or we're going to reach the people who are local. This is not the choice of the church. It's not like, well, if we do one, then we're giving up the other. That's not the choice of the church. God is going to call each of us to play a unique role, and that role might lend itself more in a hands-on way to one or the other. But the church is called to do both. So it's not that we're choosing, okay, well, we're going to reach the people locally, so people in other places in the world, tough luck. Or, you know what? These people got churches. They just got to figure this out on their own. We're going to go only where there are no churches. It's a both and. It's not either or, right? So it's not that we're saying the local people matter most, so we're going to forget the international people, or vice versa. The church is called to do both, and everybody's going to play a different role in that. And even within churches, some churches are going to play different roles in that. Some churches are going to lean heavier, more one way or the other. But the thing is, we're aiming to do both. So if somebody ever says to you, "Why go overseas? Why go there when people here don't have the gospel?" And say, yeah, that's why we do both. Yeah, you're right. That's why we're trying to reach people here, and we're trying to reach people where Christ has not been named. That it is our job to proclaim Christ both places, where we are, wherever God has placed us, right? In Frankfort, in our community, whatever doors God opens, we're to proclaim the gospel. And then to seek to go to places where the name of Christ has yet to be named. So let's talk through some practical pieces of this. Some practical steps. How do we do this? Well, one of the first things we can do is short-term mission trips. I'm gonna include in this. I'm gonna just throw all those up there. I'm gonna include in short-term mission, meaning things that are not long-term, life-altering things. So that might be a 10-day trip overseas. That might be a 5-day trip to Eastern Kentucky That might be, something short term. That might be, I think we can include in this things like Serve Frankfort and Reach Frankfort, right? Where we have these service days a few times a year in which we go serve our community. We serve in our schools. We serve other places in the community. We want to demonstrate and display the love of Jesus and to give us an open door, right? To give us help to build a relationship that we might share the gospel with people. We have built, I'll tell you, even just for the school system, we have built a great reputation with our school system because we have loved on them. We're not asking for anything of them. We're not asking to put up our sign. We're just asking to let us love on you and to build that relationship. And I tell you what, they needed some men to come mentor some troubled students, right? Some elementary age boys. And they said, we really need some men just to come spend some time with them every week. And do you know who they called? So we got Buck Run guys every week going to spend some time with some elementary school age boys who just need a man in their life, somebody to care for them and to love them and to guide them. That's why we do it. So we're trying to open doors, right? We're trying to show you need something. We'll be here to help love on your people. So we've opened doors now to influence not just those kids, but their whole families, right? To share the love of Jesus with them. So that's Serve Frankfort. Those things matter. Reach Frankfort. Anybody here when we did Reach Frankfort? We have plans to bring it back now post-COVID, where we simply just go to our neighbors. We before COVID, we hit every neighbor, every house within a 3-mile radius of Buck Run. I don't remember the number of houses, but I know it was every house within a 3-mile radius. To knock on their door and to say, hey, we're your neighbors up the street, and we just want you to know we're here, and is there a way we could pray for you? And then often they would share prayer requests. We would pray with them, and then try to get to the gospel, try to share the gospel with them in that moment. Those of you that did it, anybody slam the door in your face?
Not here in Colorado.
Yeah, Colorado, yes. I have to mean Colorado. Not here, right? Nobody slammed the door in my face. Nobody was angry. The people who didn't want to talk to me, you know what they said? No, thank you. And they shut the door, right? It was not scary, but you know what we found? People who didn't know us, who were complete strangers, often were on their porch pouring out all the junk in their life because somebody took a moment to stop and to pray with them. Somebody took some moment to, I'm not selling you anything. I don't have a big packet of pamphlets. I'm not asking you to sign up for something. I don't need your email address. I'm just saying I'm your neighbor down the street. I'm part of this church. We are here, and can we pray for you? And what we found is that after, in the months and even years since the 2 Reach Frankforts that we've done, is that some of those people came immediately. Some of those people became members of this church, but what often we've done is we've placed ourselves in their mind that they're not to the place yet where they want to come to church. But one day something's going to happen. Their life is going to fall apart. And when it does, they're going to think, I need to go somewhere. And where are they going to come? Why? Because we took the time to say, hey, we're here. We love you. We're praying for you. Right? Their kids are going to get this. The logic of this never makes sense to me. Their kids are going to turn 9, and they're going to say, you know what? We really need to have our kids in church. Right? It's as if it's good for their kids, but we don't need it, right? And where are they going to, we're trying to position ourselves in front of them. So we talk about short-term things. We're meaning things that are not long-term. You're not quitting your job. You're not selling your house. These are short-term trips. So that's, we really, post-COVID, are beginning to ramp those back up. Part of it is, even as the states turned the corner, most nations in the world did not turn the corner in the same way, even in their regulations. And you think COVID was hard on churches in the States. COVID was hard on Christians everywhere, and it was hard in a lot of places. So our partners overseas are really just now getting back to the point where it's fruitful for them to receive teams. Right? We never want to send a team to a place on which we are a burden to them. Right? It's not, Herschel calls it Jesus tourism. Right? This is not, we want to take a nice trip, and so there's a missionary there, let's go there. We want to go and be useful to them and be helpful to them. And so largely we've not taken teams, mostly because our partners have said, hey, we're not ready for teams yet. We're not ready yet. We don't have a need for you. We've got to get our ducks in a row before we can really receive teams. That's really beginning to happen. That's going to ramp up more. Who in here has ever been on an international trip with Buck Run? Where'd you go? Romania. Yeah, we were together. Yeah, I forgot that because I don't remember most of Romania because I was dying. Who else raised their hand? That's it? Well, good. All right, well, I'll have a sign-up sheet in the back, and we'll all get you overseas. So we have plans to go back to Panama. We're working with Kenny and Cheryl right now to go back to Panama. That is a much easier trip now than it has been in the past. They have a facility. 3 or 4 years ago, we went and we slept outside, which sounds a lot worse than it actually is. It really was nice. But they have a facility. They have a place in Hockey. Oh, my map is gone. There's a particular place that they have reached called Hockey that sits at the mouth of a river that runs into the ocean. And it is sort of for lack of a better word, a port city. You can only get there by boat. A plane used to fly there once a week. It doesn't anymore. You can only get there by boat. So Kenny has what would liberally be called a boat. You have to go out on the ocean. It takes about 3 hours to get there from Panama City. But it sits in the mouth of this river, and then up the river are all of these small Embera villages. And they come down to Hockey to get supplies. And so what Kenny and Cheryl have done as they've reached Embera is they have set up a base there in Hockey that is now run by Embera believers, first-generation Christians, who are then taking the gospel up the river to these other Embera villages and then over the mountains into Colombia, right? And so they're serving there as a base. So it's a phenomenal trip. There's all sorts of stuff. Some of that is working with kids. Some of that's building with your hands. They always have construction projects. The hope is to get at least one team, maybe two, to Kenny and Cheryl this year if they need it, and we can make that work. Our plan is to, just running through some of our partners, our plan is to get back to Birmingham, England. So like you've been to Romania, we still work with churches in Romania, still send medical mission trips. Largely, most of Buck Run's history in Romania has been connected to medical missions. It's a huge need there. For working with Romanians in England, medical missions, one, we're not allowed to do it, but it's also not a need there. It's a different sort of country. It's a different setup. So we work with a Romanian-American church in Birmingham, England. We're hoping to get teams back there if you're interested in working with kids. All right, what they need, they are a congregation of young Romanians that have merged with a congregation of old Englishmen and women. Yeah, that's how you say that. Ish. British congregation. So they have merged together now into one congregation, and because of both the age of the British, of the native British, and they're mostly old. Most of the Romanians are 35 and younger, and they're immigrants. So they work all sorts of sort of bottom tier jobs. They live all over the city. Birmingham is the second largest city in the UK. It's a huge city. They live all over the city. It's really difficult for them to have much time to do things like Sunday school. They have a small building. If most of your church is under 35, you got a bunch of kids. And so one of the things that we have partnered with them and the hope to do is for us to take some of what we do in our Sunday school is to come and to do some weekend things for them, to do a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, walk through the Old Testament, walk through the New Testament, do some of what we're doing here. And the goal would be we bring enough people so that nobody from their church has to stay and watch kids. That we would come and bring a team to do VBS, to work with their students and to work with their kids so that all of their adults can participate in whatever we do in the weekend. So that's a great one. We do have other RAM trips going to Romania. Those are often medical mission trips. You don't have to have medical expertise. I went on them. The medical people kept me alive on that. I really was dying. Yeah, we did VBSs at the places we were at. I sat in a waiting room and talked to people as they waited to see the medical team. Again, I have no medical expertise. We had a team that we did VBSs with the kids. There are lots of ways to be involved there, even if you got medical expertise, there's ways to be involved, certainly. But even if you don't, there are ways to do that. All that to say, we're ramping these things back up. We're working with our partners. People have sometimes asked me, how come we're not taking trips? It's because we're waiting for our partners to really say, hey, we're ready for you. Like we were ready to receive teams again. So we're working on that. If you have any interest in any of those, please see me, and I'll put you on the list. And as we get dates, I'll come to you. So short term is sort of the first step. It's a way to sort of give some of our time and money and attention to these places. When we go overseas, we always want to go where there is already a faithful Bible preaching church. Right? We're partnering with people who are on the ground. When even in Romania, when I sat in the lobby, so in Romania, we would partner with a local church, and then we would offer basically a clinic. They could come and get eyeglasses, did blood pressure, sort of basic sort of medical checkup, and try to get them some basic medication. Nothing too advanced. Where I would sit in the lobby with a translator, and I would go around and talk to people. And what I was able to say to them is not, hey, I'm an American, I came to do this for you. But what I was able to say is, hey, do you see that guy right there? His name is Narcissus. He's the pastor of this church, and this church is sponsoring this. And so we're here to help that. But they're doing this because they love you, and they're here every week. And because why? I'm going to go home, right? Either I'm going to die or I'm going to go back to America. I'm not going to be here in a week, one way or the other. But that guy will be here. What do we do? We're trying to connect the people that are on the ground that are long-term, right? Everything we do when we go overseas is to support and to come alongside the long-term presence on the ground. That if we leave and everything we've built disappears in 3 weeks, we've failed, right? We're coming alongside partners on the ground and saying, what do you need? What can we help? So often, again, that's sometimes why trips are delayed. It's because we don't want our partners to feel burdened by us. This is, I think, true of Romanian culture in general. But Scott and I went. The Romanian congregation in Birmingham, England, had their combined service last year. In May of last year was their celebration of the two congregations finally joining together. They had planned to do it before COVID, and it got delayed. And so Scott and I figured out, hey, we can make that trip. We had not seen them in a couple years and really wanted to reconnect with them post-COVID and just show our love and care for them. So we said, hey, we're coming. We want to come to that service. Well, as soon as they found out we're coming, I said, oh, okay, this is great. Okay, Chris, you'll preach the morning service, and then we have an afternoon service. Scott, and we came, no, we don't want to do that. We just want to come and be your friends, right? We just want to come be with you. There's such a hospitable culture that's no, you're our guest. You're coming. We want you to speak. So often that's true in a lot of places. As we work with our partners on the ground, we're trying to get them to say, no, tell me what you really want. Right? Tell me what would really be helpful. Don't tell me what you think we want to do. We want to do what's helpful for you. Tell us what you really need. Tell us what you really want, and then we'll figure out a way for us to meet that need. Questions on short-term stuff? Oh, I've already put those up. So second is full-time missionary work. There are steps to this. So you have things like what, I'm not going to say his name because I forget this is recorded and put on the internet, like a recent college grad from Buck Run is doing, where he's in a closed part of the world. He's actually being kicked out of that place because he couldn't get his visa and he's having to go somewhere else. He's a journeyman. He'll be there for 2-ish years to serve in a place. Again, he's put alongside long-term missionaries. He's put alongside long-term teams that live there. He's there for 2 years to come and to serve them and to share the gospel with the people group that they're particularly working with. So there are ways to do that. We had several friends in college that spent time as journeymen in different parts of the world. So that is sort of a long-term. It's not as short-term as 3 weeks, but it's not as long-term as 10 years. It's a shorter-term piece. That's often a step towards figuring out where the Lord might be calling you. But God does call people to full-time mission work. Kenny and Cheryl, if you know their story, Kenny was a truck driver and a farmer. And it was at an Easter service that they were nearing retirement age. And it was at an Easter service that they really felt the Lord was saying to them, well, I'm not done with you yet. And so when he retired, they still have their farm. Kenny didn't speak a lick of Spanish. Right? It's not as if they just knew a bunch of Spanish and thought we'd fit so well in Panama, right? No, Kenny, he was a truck driver and a farmer. He didn't know Spanish. And I'll tell you, they make fun, the Panamese, they love him. They make fun of his Spanish because it's got like a country twang. But they said, hey, we don't think the Lord is done with us yet, and we think the Lord is calling us to go overseas. And so they've been in Panama for 12 years now, I think. Not because they've had this dream all of their life, but because they are willing to say, we want to answer wherever the Lord calls. So God might be calling some of you overseas, right? Doesn't mean everybody's going, but if God calls you, you need to go. So there are short-term options. There are full-time, long-term options. There are different ways to do that. IMB, I think, we always say the IMB is the Cadillac of mission sending agencies. The IMB provides both a level of care, but also a level of support that basically no other sending agency does. And I'm not trying to brag on the IMB. The part of that is philosophy. So IMB supports their missionaries out of our funds. So when we give money to the Lottie Moon Christmas offering, that money, not a cent of that stays here. 100% of that money goes to the IMB. When we give money, I'll talk about our giving in just a minute. But when we give money to the cooperative program, money from the cooperative program goes to the IMB. The IMB then uses that money to to basically provide for their missionaries on the field. That when you go through the process with the IMB and you're accepted and you're sent to a place, you don't have to raise funds. You don't have to keep sending support letters. You don't have to come back every 3 months and do the church tour, right? You are fully supported. You have health insurance. Your family is cared for. Your living expenses are cared for. You have what you need to be where you are. Now, there are other sending agencies. IMB is not the only one. There are other sending agencies that have chosen to do it the other way, either because of lack of funds or philosophical differences in which to go overseas, you say, hey, I feel like the Lord is calling us to Malawi, then you're going to spend the next 11 months raising money and going to churches and asking, hey, can I preach, can I present what we're doing? And then you're probably going to come back every 2 years. And you're going to have to, one, send letters to those churches, hoping that they don't forget about you and find something else to give those funds to. But you've got to come back and do this sort of church tour again to continue to raise those funds, because you're responsible often for raising either all of your means or often a good deal of your means, 50, 60%. So IMB, in that way, we call it the Cadillac of sending agencies, because once you're approved, you're covered. You are provided for. And often in Southern Baptist life, we have more money to send missionaries than we have missionaries willing to go. We could send more if we had more. And I meant to look up the stat, but last I checked, it's something like 62%, I think, of IMB missionaries on the field are single women. Not single men, not married couples, right? In at least in our culture, in our SBC life, who are the people that are most likely to raise their hand and say, I'll go to the hard place, send me? It's a single woman. I don't know what that says about us, but I think it probably says more than we would like to think. So there are short-term options. There are full-time missionary options. One that has begun to open up a ton in the last decade, and is, I think, even more so now with remote work, is working abroad. So maybe you're not called to go be Kenny and Cheryl, right, to do as a full-time job. They work as missionaries. Maybe you feel like that's not my call, but your job allows you to be different places, right? You got to have a job. You got to work. You got to provide for your family. Can you do that in a strategic place? So part of what you think about even Buddy and Brooke at Overland in Fort Collins. Today, Overland is commissioning Buddy and Brooke to send out Overland's Durango. That team is moving out to plant another church. Buddy and Brooke were able to do a lot of what their job is from home, to do it in Fort Collins. We're going to take what God has given us, what God has called me to do. Can I do this then in a strategic place? So what the IMB has been doing for a decade, and not just the IMB, other organizations as well, is finding people who don't need support. Hey, I work for a Fortune 500, and they're willing to send me to Germany. I could move my position to Germany. And like, hey, we've got a team of IMB missionaries who could use a really faithful church member, who could use somebody else on their team who doesn't need support. Coca-Cola's going to pay for you to be in Germany, right? Or whoever, right? That finding, I have a job, can I do my job in a strategic place, right? That has been opening up as companies become more global in the last 20 years. But what has happened in the last few years that has really opened that up? The internet, remote work, right? Often now, it doesn't matter where you are, that you can work remotely, fully remote, and all sorts of jobs. So I think one of the things we need to consider as Christians is there a place the Lord might be calling me to where I could do my job and I could do it in a strategic place, that I could go be a part of a church plant. I could go be a part of a team of people working to reach a certain people group, that we are able to exponentially expand our reach in places. Because if the IMB is going to put 3 people in a closed country, if the IMB is going to put 3 people amongst a people group, that's 3 people, often 3 families. That's health insurance, that's living expenses, that's travel expenses, or that's all the things that come with, that's paying for visas, or that's all the things that come with putting those people in country. What if we could say, well, we can actually have a team of 12, and we only have to foot the bill for 3? Because the other 9 are able to provide for themselves because of their jobs. They're able to do their jobs in a strategic place. So it's a thing to consider. Some of you that are near retirement age, right? You're thinking, man, what am I going to do when I retire? You might consider taking your retirement in a strategic place. You know how many churches around the world, church planters and missionaries around the world would love to have just some faithful church members? who can provide their own way and who can just go be a part of a church and share the gospel and be a faithful member of a church. All right, questions there? All right, some things to think about. First steps. Pray for the Lord to lay a particular people on your heart. Anybody ever heard of the book Operation World? It's a great book. It walks through a lot of these people groups. You can go both to the Joshua Project or imb.com/people groups. You can find information on both of those. Joshua Project, I believe, still every day puts a different people group up on their homepage. You want to learn about people groups? Go, and every day they'll tell you about a different people group, where they are, what language they speak, how reached they are, the work that's going on in those places. IMB puts out a calendar every year you can put on your desk. So does North American Mission Board, that has pictures of every month. IMB used to have one that was every day. You could pray for a different missionary around the world. I noticed even Elizabeth had her magazine from GAs that she was reading the other day, and in there it had birthdays of missionaries around the world. Here are birthdays. You can be praying for those, and there were several that all we had was the initials, and it just said, these are missionaries that are serving in a closed country, but it's their birthday. And so there are tons of ways to put different people groups in front of your face. When you watch the news, right? What are you going to hear about often? You're going to hear about world events, and you're going to hear about different people groups. Let that be a thing that spurs you to think about, to pray for, to go look up those people group, to know maybe what's going on there, what presence do we have there as Christians? Is there any work there that's happening? And pray for the Lord to lay a particular people on your heart. You're not going to be burdened for everybody everywhere, but you might find the Lord might give you a particular burden for a particular people. And then look for opportunities to go there. Again, we have, at Buckrun, we have specific partners that we work with, both domestically and internationally. But those aren't the only people. Those aren't the only missionaries around the world. Those are our partnerships. That we can't work with everybody to the same degree, but these are the people that we have linked arms with. Look for opportunities to go, whether that's to Romania. There are tons of people at Buckrun. Steve Jones has been to Romania more than most Romanians, right? I think he's been to Romania, I think he told me 23 times or something. It's a crazy number. They have a heart to reach Romania. Bill Nally, for years, had a heart to care for orphans in Haiti. It was a burden that was on his heart. So pray for the Lord to put a particular people on your heart. And then look for opportunities. Maybe that's just praying for them, right? Maybe that's just continue to pray and continue to keep up with what's happening. But you might have opportunities to go. Research areas of the world where the gospel is needed. I think I have a picture. Anybody ever heard of the 1040 window? Right, this is the 1040 window. It's the latitude lines. Right? Okay. Yes, it's 10 and 40?
Yes, between
Okay.
the 10
Yeah.
and the 40.
Okay, I should have looked more up of why it's called the 1040 window. This is the 1040 window. It's the latitude lines of 10 and 40. We call this the 1040 window. It is from 10 degrees to 40 degrees north of the equator. The majority of the world's Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists live in this window. In these countries, these areas that are selected. It's called the resistance belt by missiologists. 37 of the world's 50 least evangelized countries are in the 1040 window. 97% of the total population of the least evangelized countries are there. So 37 of the 50 are in this window. If you just count people, 97% of the populations that are least evangelized live in the 1040 window. There are over 1 billion Muslims, over 1 billion Hindus, and nearly 800,000 Buddhists that live in the 1040 window. 82% of the poorest people on the planet live in the 1040 window. The top 50 least evangelized cities that have at least 1 million people, right? So big city, at least 1 million people. Top 50 of the top 50 least evangelized cities that have at least 1 million people, all of them are in the 1040 window. All of them fit within this box. So what percentage of the world's evangelical missionaries, so not just talking Southern Baptists, but evangelical meaning we believe they actually are preaching the gospel. What percentage of the world's missionaries do you think serve in the 1040 window? 8%. It is the highest concentration of lostness in the world, right here. And 8% of the world's missionaries serve here. Why do you think that is? It's dangerous, right? We know a lot of these countries. Right? It's dangerous, right? There's often danger. What else? Hard to get to, right? Sometimes location, right? It's hard to really get to. What else? Yeah, you can't. Sometimes these are hard countries to get into, right? That you can't raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to come as a missionary and tell people about Jesus, right? You have to come in under a student visa. You have to come in as a businessman. You have to come in some other way in order to be able to be in the country. These are difficult countries to get into. What else? Desire, right? So these are really hard places to live, right? Aside from persecution, aside from government barriers getting into the country, these are difficult places to live. These are really hard countries often. So you have kids, you have a family, it's a really hard place to go. What else? Language, right? These are all hard languages, right? If you know Jake and Holly Hart, they were literally got to the 1040 window as COVID hit, and then had to come home. We're working with a very specific people group in the 1040 window in a very specific region in which their language was basically unlike any of the other languages. So they were having to do language school for the main language of the area, but then also have to do language school for their particular people group that they're working with. How long does it take? Do you know how long they say it takes to generally become fluent in a language? It's close to 10. To be truly conversational with a native speaker, they say close to a decade. That's hard. These are hard languages to learn. There are so many of them that often when people go to these areas, they're having to learn multiple languages just to try to survive, just to get through the day, just to be able to pay their bills and get their groceries, much less try to reach people for the gospel. All right, other reasons you think it might be hard to go here? Very little local church partners. Very few places where there are strong churches for us to work with. How easy do you think it is to come home and see Grandma and Grandpa at Christmas when you live in the 1040 window? It's pretty hard. You live in Fort Collins, you can get on a flight. You go to Canada, you go to Panama. Panama's 3 hours from Atlanta on plane. It's pretty easy. Not easy when you're in India, Bangladesh, in China, right? It's not easy when you're literally on the other side of the world, and plane tickets are incredibly expensive, and you risk not being able to get back into the country, right? So I told you, Jake and Holly, they left their place. There is still an apartment in their area they left in March of 2020 that has a bunch of their stuff in it. They can't get back in the country, and they're trying to get other partners to go and to get some of their stuff back, and some of that is just lost. They'll never get it back. The IMB, this is true, I think, for almost everywhere in the world, but particularly when the IMB sends people to the 1040 window. When you go to the IMB, you often get a shipping container. They might do two now, but you get to basically pack a shipping container. You can pack your stuff in there, and so then they send you to the country, and then they send your shipping container later. They send it to you. It used to be, I don't know if it's still the case, that shipping container would not come. They would not send it till about 8 or 10 months after you've arrived. Do you know why they did that? Kick out was part of the worry. You know how many people don't make it 8 months? You know how expensive it is to send a shipping container of stuff to the 1040 window? And so the IMB has learned, we wait, and we want to make sure that you're going to make it, that you're going to be there in 8 months. So we don't want to send it and then have to try to ship all this stuff back. It's an incredibly, incredibly difficult place to be. So there is an incredible need. There are tons and tons of spots where we need people to go to the 1040 window. Maybe that's you, but you can be praying, right? Again, you want to ask me his name, I'll tell you his name. I'll tell you where he is, just not here because this is going online. We have a student right now, a college student, Buck Run, who's a journeyman in the 1040 window, right? He is trying to get back in. He was in on a visa which he could not renew. He's going to they're sending him to another place in the world that's less dangerous, but allows him to still work with that same people group that is living abroad. And he's going to go work with them for a bit while he works to get a student visa, to get admittance into a local university so that he can come back to the 1040 window to be able to serve. There are tons of ways. You want his address? I'll give you his address. You can send him cards and letters. You can pray for him, right? There are tons of ways to support even those that are on the 1040 window, even if you can't go. Maybe the Lord has not called you to that. There might be all sorts of reasons why the Lord is not calling you to the 1040 window. But this should be on our heart and on our mind. Again, these are all the countries that are in the news all the time. When we see them in the news, let it be a reminder to pray for the gospel work that's there, to pray for Christians that are there, to pray for missionaries that are there, that more people would hear the gospel and believe and be saved, for God to raise up more people to go, that God would send more missionaries. Right? Do you know what country in the world sends the most missionaries? Korea. Not America. We don't send the most missionaries. We think of that, right? Well, it's Americans. We send the most. Koreans. South Korea. Per capita, per church. Yeah. It's not Americans. It's Korea. The highest percentage of the church of the churches is Korea. I believe second per capita is the African region, not one particular country, right? Per church member. So we're praying for the Lord to raise up workers to go into the field from our churches, but from the global church, that from all over the world, the people would take the gospel to the ends of the earth. All right, a couple things I'll tell you quickly if you want to just know some of our numbers. Again, Lottie Moon Christmas offering, every single cent of that goes to the IMB, International Mission Board. We don't keep any of that. None of that stays in-house. That all goes to the International Mission Board. 60% of their budget, yearly budget, I think, comes from the Lottie Moon Christmas offering. North American Mission Board, Dr. York mentioned last week, Annie Armstrong Easter offering. So it is the same thing, but it's for the North American, which is so domestic missions. IMB is outside North America, and NAM is everything within North America. 100% of the Annie Armstrong Easter offering goes directly to that. It's the one time you'll really hear us push an offering because we're pretty shameless about it because it's not for us. None of it stays here. We don't take it. None of it stays here. Every single cent goes to missionaries and to church planting work on the ground in North America and overseas. If you remember when we have our yearly business meeting, big business meeting in November, where we walk through sort of the plan for the coming year and vote on the budget. These numbers are in there, but I'll give them to you again. Buck Run every year gives our total missions giving is about, it works out to close to about 15% of our budget. $218,920 is what our missions giving is every year. And again, that I don't know the exact percent, but it's about 15% of our budget. So the goal is that 15 cents out of every dollar that you give goes directly to some missions work, right? Whether that's church plants, whether that's domestic. I'll tell you where those go. So 156 of that goes to the cooperative program. It's one of the best things about the Southern Baptist Convention is the cooperative program, which we give money so that we, as Southern Baptists, there are 40,000 of us, we all collectively put our money in this pot, and then we use that pot to do all sorts of great things. That pot funds all the seminaries, the 6 Southern Baptist seminaries. It funds both the North American Mission Board. It funds the IMB. It funds, helps to fund Pieces of Lifeway, ERLC, or we put our money together, we pull our money together so that we can do that. So 156 of that goes directly to the cooperative program. Another 14,000 of that goes to domestic mission partners. So that's Overland, that's Durango, that's other non-international partners that we have directly. Another 20,000 of that goes to our international partners. So we support monthly a Romanian pastor in Romania. We support one of the elders, the Romanian elders of the church in Birmingham, England. We have other international partners, so that 20 of that goes directly to church partners that are overseas. And then another 28 of that is for local missions. So that's money we spend with Serve Frankfort and Reach Frankfort. That's money that goes to Avenues for Women. That's money that goes to the food bank. That's money that goes to trying to minister, particularly in mission-oriented ways, to our local community. So that's sort of how that 218,000 breaks down. But just so you know, about 15% of every dollar you give to Buck Run goes right out the door, right? So we're not not even things that we would do in-house, not VBS, not those. It goes right out the door, either directly overseas or through the CP, or sometimes directly to our partners, our missionary partners that are on the ground. Any questions about any of these things? Or comments? All right, it's a heavy day thinking about all these numbers. We go back to the very beginning. We trusted at the throne of God, around the throne, at the end of all things, will be people from every tribe and tongue, language, and nation. We just believe God is going to do it, and God is using us to do it. And what a beautiful thing. It is daunting to think about the 4 billion people, there's nearly really 6 billion people who don't have the gospel, almost 6 billion people who don't have the gospel. It's really daunting to think about that, but then to think, man, around the throne there will be people from every tribe, language, people, and nation. What a joyful thing it'll be.